Faith, God, and religion. Topics: predestined by God, creationists, chosen, humanity, adaptation, atheist, intolerance. Part 1. We discussed God and religions. The occasion was a boating accident in which several hundred pilgrims of an Eastern religious group drowned. There is probably no religion or denomination, I observed, in which followers haven't perished in horrific disasters while practicing their faith, sometimes by the thousands. And yet, people continue to believe. These people only wanted to serve their God and died miserably in the process. Can one speak of God's justice in such a situation? But there seems to be nothing a religious person wouldn't excuse in God's name, because an unjust God is generally inconceivable to them. With the most astute mental gymnastics, they conjure up justifications meant to demonstrate that what happened was God's will and that he surely knows what he is doing. The followers say, God's ways are inscrutable. If you were to give a definition of God, what would you say? Conversations partner, CP, asked. God is a form inherent in the primal structure of humanity, imbued with the sense of an omnipotent being. A significant aspect of this primal structure is the concept of the leader, the figure to whom one trusts and submits, because he knows everything and does everything right. This was particularly important for living beings, like early humans, to ensure their survival. Herein, with a high degree of probability, lies the true origin of the concept of God. Since this is deeply rooted in human nature, it continues to be shaped, even today, by the desire to submit to someone in this way, particularly through emotions. Especially in early childhood, this concept of God is often projected onto caregivers. The existence of something mystical, supernatural, God, was an absolute truth for early humans, conveying their sense of self. This also helped them understand the world. This has become deeply ingrained in our primal structures and continues to have an effect today. It often shapes the brain, particularly between the ages of 3 and 5 during human development, in the mystical phase. Since this being, it feels, believes that everything is possible, goals in adulthood often draw upon this. This goal is thus reactivated particularly often in emergency situations, crises, and so on, later in life, when God is asked for help. I smiled. But one could also define God like this: God is law. And one could further say, God's ways are indeed unfathomable. One cannot see all the laws to recognize that everything had to happen exactly as it did. How do you define laws? Identical substances under identical circumstances always produce identical structures. Or, put another way, under precisely the same circumstances, identical substances must produce precisely the same consequences. The laws governing substances can never be changed. They can only form their structure according to them. They determine every process. For many people, God is something that has all power and is infallible. But in the world, there is only one thing that is truly infallible and has all power: the laws. You mean the laws of the universe? Yes. In small parts, like the atom, or on a large scale, like the cosmos. There are people who use this knowledge to be godlike. They say, whoever understands the laws has all power. If you set aside the godlike aspect, which has much to do with hubris, it is indeed true. Only by submitting to the necessary laws can you achieve your goals, of course, only if you have the assets. Do you mean values by assets? Yes, things, forces, energies. Can't laws be changed, and thus, their power broken? No, they are eternal. One can only exchange laws for others, create different ones, by adding or subtracting values, that is, by structural changes, because the same substances under the same circumstances always produce the same result. This is an irrefutable fact. And not everything is possible, but only what the laws permit. No one and nothing can ever be outside of them. Isn't this definition, that God is law, too impersonal, too cold for many people? That's probably true. For most people, it's too abstract. After all, it's just a tool for explanation. People need something concrete they can let go of, something they feel safe in, something that gives them hope, something all-powerful. Faith is important to them. And I think almost everyone has their own faith, even if God plays practically no role. But as the history of the world has shown, no God or faith is all-powerful, because if that were the case, the world would look different, more harmonious, and safer. Thus, faith reveals itself to be what it ultimately is: a dream, created from the need for emotional stability, hope for comfort, and the longing for eternity. Answer: religions meet the desire of most people to believe in something and to be able to live according to those convictions. Because many people cannot resist, or rather, do not want to resist the feeling of religiosity, there will probably be religions, sects, or other faiths as long as there are people. Unfortunately, faith is often selfish. This is evident in their dogmas, scriptures, and traditions, which exhibit intolerance towards those of other faiths, based on the motto, "Only my faith is true, only my God is real." Therefore, anything that does not conform to their beliefs is rejected or fought against. People are often guided by their feelings, and these can give them absolute certainty that what they believe is right. Religions and other faith communities claim to possess the one and only path to salvation. They are trapped within this midpoint. They demand that their members do everything possible to ensure that the rest of humanity adopts this faith. This goes so far as to demand that all those who do not adhere to this faith be labeled as unbelievers and destroyed. Their delusion prevents them from seeing that they are demanding the impossible. The goals that drive people are far too diverse, thus destroying any sense of unity. Thus, these faith communities repeatedly bring unrest, violence, and death into the world. Through the powerful midpoint of faith, humanity can indeed be absolutely to be convinced of the legitimacy of his actions. Those who live within a particular faith, that is, within a specific worldview, a particular structure, cannot do otherwise. Their world would otherwise collapse. Now, if the God of a particular faith were truly all-powerful, then he could easily, from one moment to the next and for all eternity, set everything right according to his will, grant justice to the world, justice according to human understanding. Aren't the laws just? CP asked. What is just? Just comes from direction, directed toward a goal. And what fits that goal is right. Living beings have very specific goals within them. For example, life, freedom, basic needs like drinking, eating, warmth, and sexuality. That means, living beings follow their goals, their direction. The laws also follow their goal, their direction. For them, what happens and how it happens is right. But this often doesn't align with people's goals and desires. Seen in this light, the laws are often unjust. But humans aren't at the center. Everything doesn't revolve around them as they would like. They are only a microscopically small part of the whole. And this microscope, viewed universally, would have to magnify enormously to even see humans. Well, CP said, but there are quite a few people who are absolutely convinced that God exists. That's true, I replied, but it exists only in people's minds. That's not what they mean. Well, God and religions will likely continue to enjoy unbroken popularity until the end of humanity because they offer a framework for interpreting the meaning of life and fulfilling all desires, or they lessen the fear of death. People like to shape the afterlife according to their desires in this life. This is probably also one reason why many people are religious, even though the dogmas and tenets of all religions are built on shaky ground. God and religions are pure inventions, as such unbound by reality, and thus ideal for developing and expressing one's own ideas and feelings. Hardly anyone can escape the feelings that have formed and become ingrained in the psyche from the beginning of multicellular life to the present day. Using one's cognitive abilities would be helpful, but even with that, these feelings are hardly swayed. Predestined by God, many people, gladly, believe that God guides humanity and the world. This leads to the idea, and the brain's goal, that everything is predestined by God. Answer: they believe that everything has a purpose, which a higher mystical authority has initiated and is carrying out. And this leads to some very strange explanations. If someone has experienced something they perceive as negative, then later in life, when something good happens to them, they often come to the conclusion, now I understand why I experienced that back then, because what I am experiencing now was predetermined by it. The brain has arrived at this conclusion, which it cites as proof, because of the purpose that God determines everything. Does God really only originate in the brain, as a self-generated structure within the human being? Absolutely. Religion has a lot to do with feeling and little with reason. The brain is the seat of feelings. To ask again, where do you think the belief in an all-powerful figure comes from? As I said, it's already present as a predisposition. And then from childhood, shaped, among other things, by experiences with overbearing adults, because it's important for a child to entrust themselves to someone who cares for them. So, is God, among other things, a transference from childhood experiences with caregivers, where it was about support, security, and so on. That seems to me to be an important reason. It's not that someone is sitting in heaven pulling the strings. Rather, there are substances that operate according to laws, in this case, neurons and their connections in the brain, that are responsible for the concept of God. It seems to be a fact that many people believe they cannot live without the idea of a higher being. the sense of security that developed during childhood could otherwise be lost. This sense of security, as mentioned, was generated, among other things, by a close person and transferred to an inherent, primal structure of God, or to general belief systems, which are, among other things, cultural constructs, a transfer of the infant's basic trust that its caregivers will provide for everything necessary, and later, that God will provide for everything necessary. Religious people say, I experience within myself an absolute ground, God, who sustains me, from whom everything. This beautifully illustrates the concept of transmission. Parents, caregivers, support you. Everything originates from them: love, security, warmth, fulfillment of basic needs, and so on. If there is no metaphysical God, then the saying, God helps those who help themselves, really hits the nail on the head, CP remarked. Yes, and so one could say, God helps those who help themselves, and then the God projected outwardly will also help you. And that's generally how people act. But many people still believe, deep down, in God's work as a force existing outside of us. And isn't it much nicer to live with the belief that there is someone who holds their protective hand over you, rather than seeing yourself, like everything else in the world, as operating solely according to values and laws? That is indeed more beautiful, and that's why people do it. But God, as I said, arises through neural circuits and physiological processes. For many people, it's not only unimaginable but also absolutely unbearable to realize that we are alone on Earth, without a higher being of any kind or from any dimension outside the world. And why don't you believe? I can't believe such things. I'm too attached to the truth and too interested in discovering what's real, what lies behind apparent truths. I'm more of a seeker of knowledge. My thirst for knowledge and my search for truth are far too great to satisfy me with mere belief. When you look at living beings, and especially humans, you might not be able to help but admire the engineer who created this marvel, humanity. But if you look more closely at how this marvel behaves, what flaws it can have, then you're much less inclined to admire the engineer. I looked at him thoughtfully. And just as the fact that there is no God is inconceivable to most people, so too is the fact that there is no free will. This brings us back to the age-old adage, know thyself. If you go through life with your eyes open, you can recognize God's work in everyday life. What you see is that everything operates according to substances and laws, that people align their behavior, and must align it, with the goals within them, and that every form of altruism, upon closer inspection, turns out to be egoism. If you look at the history of life, or rather, of humankind, you see that simple forms of life arose about 3.5 billion years ago because the conditions on our planet made this possible. Life developed and differentiated over a long period until, about 4 million years ago, human evolution began. All the steps are traceable, and there is nothing that is not in accordance with the laws of nature. But isn't this realization that there is no God quite terrifying? Doesn't it fuel the fear of being alone? You're so completely on your own, without help from heaven, from outer space, or beyond. Perhaps people still want to believe in God or a higher power because otherwise they truly feel alone, CP remarked. But isn't this realization that there is no God quite terrifying? Doesn't it fuel the fear of being alone? Creationists. This is how religious communities like the creationists can arise. They are a prime example of people who ignore reality. With a great deal of money and power, they steadfastly assert that only what is written in the Bible is true. Creationists have money, money grants power, and this in turn can lead to stupidity because one doesn't feel the need to submit to criticism. Although science has proven through various fossil finds that the evolution of humankind began millions of years ago, creationists firmly maintain that God created humans 6,000 years ago. They believe in Genesis, which states that the Creator God created everything within 6 days, heaven and earth, sun and moon, animals and humans, and so on, literally as described in the Bible. They reject the Big Bang and all hypotheses about the origin of the cosmos because this does not align with the Bible. They deny that Earth's history spans many billions of years. They are ancient and claim that the Earth has existed for a maximum of 10,000 years. Because, according to the Bible, all creatures were created at the same time, they believe evolution cannot be true and therefore oppose it. The fact that science has reached completely different conclusions is either ignored or vehemently denied. Thus, they live in their own fantasy world. Such a fantasy world is only possible because of the meta-worlds that can create goals in people's brains, I explained. Isn't this way of looking at the world perfectly suited for escapism, for example, if one is afraid of life? CP added, could be chosen, I continued, Some people, especially those who have achieved success, believe they are chosen by God, I stated, and went on. When something good happens to someone, when they are lucky or achieve a goal exceptionally well, they often feel that fate willed it so. They attribute this to a higher power that intended exactly what has now happened to them. I smiled. When you're lucky in life, you can easily get carried away with vain thoughts. These people might then feel like the chosen ones, whom God has elevated above others, and they like to ignore the fact that they had to do what they did because of substances and laws, and not because a God chose them. Their belief in this often stems from a childhood imprint, the desire to be chosen by their caregiver, to be preferred over everyone else. And they feel good when they believe such a thing. The idea is indeed very seductive. When vanity, I call it, selfishness, threatens to rise up in me, I remind myself that everything had to happen the way it did, and that quickly brings me back down to earth. Many people probably do believe that they are doing what they do in accordance with God's will, on His behalf or a higher power, CP remarked. As long as there have been societies, there have always been rich and poor, I pointed out. The poor often perceived this as unjust and prayed to God for justice. The rich, on the other hand, saw this state of affairs as divinely ordained. They justified it by saying that they were among God's chosen people, and thus everything was as it should be. Perhaps these people should realize, if it is at all possible for them, that they are actually only doing what they do out of their own self-interest. The concept of God is an excellent tool for trying to impose one's own ideas. This concept is as patient as a sheet of paper. God is also a wonderful tool for trying to mold people according to one's own ideas. What do you think about someone who is proud of their birth, their heritage? It doesn't surprise me that people who have inherited something, be it psychological, physical, or material, are often proud of it. Even though they did nothing to create these ancestors, they want to experience these feelings. So, you mean that God is law? CP asked to be sure. That's right, in a figurative sense. And that's also the best thing to do, to conform to the laws, because conformity is probably the most important thing in life. Since the laws have all the power, one would be well advised to recognize this and act accordingly. It may all be as you describe it, CP said, but I think many people can't do otherwise. They have to believe in God as a supernatural being. That's what they've grown up with. Otherwise, there's an emptiness inside them, and they feel lonely and abandoned. I can certainly understand that, I nodded. Humanity. Another question, don't you believe that religion is a necessary condition for humanity? It certainly isn't. People generally have empathy, that is, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. Our brains are capable of sensing the inner lives of others. We can empathize because neural networks within us reflect and imitate these feelings, allowing us to put ourselves in their shoes. We experience similar emotions and can, to a greater or lesser extent, understand the experiences of other people. This can generate compassion and the urge to help. This often happens completely without any religious context. But many say that religion is important for helping others, because otherwise, compassion wouldn't arise. Yes, they say that because they want to maintain the religion that sustains them emotionally. Belief in God will probably always flare up again as long as there are people, despite all valid counter-arguments. This isn't necessarily related to intelligence. Even intelligent people often act this way. Emotional faith and superstition will often be stronger than reason. Thus, even intelligent people won't want to or be able to abandon their faith for emotional reasons. Does that mean that intelligence plays no significant role in the question of faith? That's how it seems to me. Why do people often fail to notice that something is outdated or simply no longer true? Because they usually don't question behaviors they learned in the early years of their lives, they simply adopt them because others do the same. Because something has always been that way, society is used to it. They simply conform to the spirit of the times. Adjustment. How do you view the precepts of religions? They prescribe strict rules of conduct. They are instructions from religious founders and leaders who followed specific goals within themselves to regulate life in the community. These instructions particularly address the emotional sphere and often offer considerable resistance to change. They act similarly to dictators who impose their opinions by any means necessary. Of course, behavior should adapt to changing environmental conditions, and in principle, the rules of conduct should also change. But this doesn't happen because rigid dogmas prevail. Thus, it can happen that precepts from religious leaders that are 1,000 years old or more are still valid today, and people follow them even though the world has completely changed. But everyone probably has ingrained behaviors that developed in the past, perhaps because they were once useful and are still active today. And these behaviors exhibit a strong resistance to change, even though the structure of the world has shifted. But everyone probably has ingrained behaviors that developed in the past, perhaps because they were once useful and are still active now. And they resist change strongly, even though the structure of the world has changed. You mean these behaviors should actually be discarded? It would be healthy if believers could manage that. Religion, sects, and belief in the supernatural in general offer people the advantage, similar to drugs, that everything else is no longer perceived through their central focus. Even if it's wonderful to indulge in the feeling that one's own faith is the only true one should try to keep reminding oneself that faith is ultimately not knowledge. Like any other, it's just a feeling. Feelings don't need proof, and that can lead to blindness. Part 2. Atheist. You're an atheist, CP, another conversation partner, remarked. What's it like living without God? In a life without God, you have freedom from otherworldly ideologies. You don't miss anything. What should I miss? The lack of freedom afforded by faith. The cage you're locked in. You once said, belief in God can be an addiction. I still believe that today. Religion is blinding. God, religion, faith, mysticism, etc., can truly be like drugs. But don't we need that cage, that religious dogma that dictates how we should behave, how we should live? There can be values, security, a firm worldview. And people need values. They are the goals by which they live. I choose my own worldview within my own framework, and this framework contains the values that give me security and well-being. And what about the values of society? If you say, I choose my own worldview, doesn't your worldview differ from that of your surroundings, the society in which you live? More or less. And that doesn't bother you? Of course, I respect the values of others. And naturally, I also respect the personal values of the people I'm with. That's inherent in my own framework, which includes empathy, having the best possible relationship with people, reaching out to them, and trying to help. To get back to your question, I would be bothered by the lack of freedom if I had to live according to values that don't resonate with me. Furthermore, I'm bothered by the detachment from reality that faith often underpins. Religious people can't face life, and the world, openly, or rather, they see what their brains, through their belief system, are telling them. Their dogma, or more precisely, their goals, allow them to see the world only within a specific framework. But if you were to ask these people, they would surely answer that they themselves face life openly with their faith, and that people like you, Mr. Hermsk, don't see the world properly. You're probably right about that. And there's a clearly identifiable reason for that opinion. You mean the midpoint principle? Yes, the midpoint is the shape that defines a goal. The goal here is the execution of faith, which molds people into a form that conforms to dogma. From this perspective, they perceive the world. Everything else is ignored, and this leads to a detachment from reality and the belief that one sees the world correctly, while others see it incorrectly. Faith has imprisoned these people. In the truest sense of the word, they live in the prison of faith. Observing these processes is always fascinating to me. That this is done exclusively by the neurons in the brain, which connect to form networks and thus shape the world that people see. So, God is merely a construct of the brain. That's perfectly clear. The brain projects God into the world with its emotions. Religion is like a movie in the mind, with emotions as the driving force. You mean the topic of God leads many people into blindness? When you ask deeply religious people how they know God exists, they say, I know. And if you press them further, they say, I know that God exists. They rarely say, as would actually be correct, I believe that God exists. Because it's merely a feeling within them that gives them this certainty. They mean that even when people say, I believe, they actually mean, I know. I nodded, and so, they are trapped in their feelings, lost in their sense of God, unable to see the truth. Believers often argue this way to prove God's existence. Since everything originated from something, or was created by someone, the universe must also have been created by someone. And that someone was God. And God is beyond question. He is the ultimate reason, he encompasses everything. Well, I replied, for me, the universe is the ultimate reason. It has always existed, and everything originated and originates from it. The universe can no longer be questioned because it encompasses everything. They simply project this view, that everything must have originated from something, onto the universe from their everyday experience, without engaging with it in any depth. Intolerance. CP considered this. Then he said, What bothers you about faith in general is the intolerance. Yes, and the violence that can stem from it, as we have seen in the past and are seeing in the present. How many atrocities have been and are being committed in the name of faith? When I look at religions, I often find the word peace. If peace is the goal, how can these atrocities happen? Because every religion has its own view of God and the world. As a rule, this view clashes with other religions. Most religions claim to possess the only saving wisdom, the wisdom that leads to peace. It's clear, if every religion says there is only one God, namely its own, then this leads to conflicts with other religions or worldviews, and often to atrocities. Intolerance arises because many people genuinely believe their perspective, their belief, is the only true one. Every God, every religion, every worldview has its own goals, its own value system. The more extreme these goals are, the more extreme the behavior toward those who think differently or are considered unbelievers, often leading to violence and inhumanity. So, you're saying believers are out of touch with reality? Inevitably, because faith is based on human-made assumptions, making unbiased thinking impossible. For example, the fact that everything unfolds according to substances and laws, organic or inorganic, on Earth or elsewhere in the universe. This means that there is nothing, not even anything supernatural, such as a God, that could, freely, intervene in these processes. It follows that everything had to happen the way it did. That is reality. Anyone who doesn't recognize this, and believers in God cannot recognize it because their belief in God blocks their access, is out of touch with reality. From your personal perspective, Mr. Hermsk, do you find it easier to accept events or behavior? Yes, I don't need a creed that, for example, tells me to forgive my neighbor. From this perspective, you see the past, including what just happened, with different eyes. If you're practiced in this way, you can usually view it much more leniently than someone who believes there is absolute freedom for humankind. So, you also accept the atrocities committed in the name of faith. It had to happen the way it did. So, you also accept the atrocities committed in the present. If I can't change them, I have no other choice. What happens, happens, as it happens. Without God, one is more adaptable and resilient, which is ultimately healthier. The crucial point is the realization that everything here is a product of one's own brain, ultimately of ingrained primal structures. Imagine if all beliefs and ideologies were seen by people for what they truly are, constructs of our brains. That would elevate personal responsibility to a completely different level because the superstructure, the belief system by which one evaluates one's views and actions, would no longer exist. People could no longer justify horrific acts against those who think differently with God or other ideologies, but would, when it came to justifying their behavior, be left to their own devices. Wouldn't it end in anarchy if religious and idealized behaviors disappeared? That certainly wouldn't happen if other primal structures and one's own framework, which regulates one's own behavior and takes into account the laws of the society in which one lives, were to take their place. If someone who previously believed in God, miracles, mysteries, and so on, could realize that these things don't exist out there, but were merely a construct of their own mind, then they would suddenly see the world completely differently and behave differently towards it. Statements like, "My actions are mandated by God," turn out to be utterly empty. And, you can no longer shift responsibility onto a higher power. Personal responsibility immediately comes into play. Then you don't expect help from heaven, but know that ultimately you can only help yourself. You should really be aware of this. These people believe that heaven is protecting them, just as their parents once did. But heaven is neutral. In reality, they are simply mistaking heaven for their parents. So, heaven is neutral means help yourself. There's no help from mystical sources or anything like that, from a God. Yes, it really makes a difference whether you go through life with the awareness that someone is watching over you, like God, or whether you are responsible for yourself. There is no help from heaven. In the first case, you go through life dreaming, still in your childhood, where your parents or other caregivers protectively watched over you. This also means having very specific expectations of life, how it should be, what it owes you, and so on. And consequently, often disappointment, anger at life, at fate, or heaven, because something didn't turn out as expected. But if you go through life with the attitude that you are responsible for yourself, and are also aware that everything that happened had to happen the way it did, then these uproar finds no fuel. And you can much more quickly detach yourself from the events of the past and direct your energy toward what lies ahead. In short, you're freer. Where does faith come from? The roots of religion lie in our genes, in our primal structures, in the drive to submit to a leader. What do you think about prayer? I know there's no help from heaven. If I want something, I try my best to recognize structures and laws and adjust my behavior accordingly. What do you think of the ancient scriptures on which religions are based and which people believe were dictated by God? Since I don't believe in God, the idea that these scriptures were determined by God seems unrealistic to me. I think they were created by people who put their own and inherited ideas about the world down on paper. So, this is entirely human, without any supernatural help. Of course. But unfortunately, it's true. People believe that what their feelings tell them is also real in the world. For example, that there is a God, that some mystical figure has spoken to the leading figures of their religion, that these figures have received a mission from something supernatural. These feelings can become so intense that they completely enslave people. It's impossible for them to recognize that it's merely a trick of their minds. This process is similar to addiction. The addict is solely focused on gratification. Everything else is devalued, sometimes to zero. For many people, faith in their religion, their God, is their only hope. They feel comfortable with it. Faith in God helps them, CP interjected. May everyone live as they wish, as long as they don't become violent, I replied. There is certainly no real God in the external world of these believers, but the faith within them can, of course, be very effective as a source of motivation or comfort. Most people are bound, shackled by the traditions, views, and convictions they carried from childhood into adulthood. These are things they experienced and adopted from their caregivers. Hence the belief that God will sort it out, or, in a figurative sense, that their former caregivers will sort it out. So, are the concept and belief in God a projection of the feeling of the overwhelming power of their former caregivers, such as their parents? I've said this before, that this is how I see it. It can be extremely unhealthy to simply let things happen, with this belief. Because you're no longer a child, with adults protectively watching over you. Therefore, whatever you want, you can't expect help from heaven, in any form whatsoever. The best help is to help yourself. Heaven just watches, unmoved, no matter what you do or what happens to you. If you know there's no God to help you, then you also know, as I said, that ultimately you can only help yourself. This can lead to activating your own energy to solve problems and avoid disappointment, along the lines of, why did God allow this? Or why did this have to happen to me? Doesn't God love me? Or something like that. Whatever is meant to happen, whatever you want to achieve, you should never rely on help from heaven. Instead, you should rely on your own destiny. Take it into your own hands. With your own framework, one you've created yourself. By framework, do you mean the same as constitution, perhaps the constitution of a society? Exactly. What other fundamental differences are there between believing in God and living without God? For example, religious believers often advocate retribution, revenge. I say one should simply try to prevent similar behavior in the future. Of course, for the sake of a functioning society, this can include the perpetrator having to pay for their actions, in whatever form that may take. What about the belief in free will? Here, the differences aren't as great as they might initially seem. For religious believers, free will is perfectly clear. I know that there is no free will because everything is predetermined by values and laws. Nevertheless, I act in every moment of the present as if I had free will, because I don't know what is supposed to happen. What is your view on the belief in life after death? As an aspirational fairy tale, I know that, universally speaking, we are nothing special. If something in the universe loses its specific structure, then it no longer exists. It doesn't live on somewhere as a spiritual being. It's the same with us humans. When we die, we lose our specific structure. You mean we lose our individual human structure, but remain in the universe? Of course, nothing and no one can fall out of the universe because it encompasses everything. We were, are, and always will be in the universe. Only our goals, which created our midpoints, the world as we saw it, dissolved after our death. You're saying one can't recognize the world, can't see it as it actually is. Most people believe that the world, as they see it, is always the same. But you can't perceive it in general terms, you can only ever see it from a perspective. In our human case, from the human perspective of our brain. We construct the world from our goals, which place us in a corresponding view. That's how we see the world, that's how the brain shapes it. But it only exists in this form as long as we are here, as long as we are alive. If we die, then this structure of the world no longer exists. So, the world is an illusion. From our objective point of view, yes. I believe that whoever sees the world can only perceive it from their own perspective. As a rule, this is a real human perspective, shown to us by our brain, so not an illusion in the sense just asked. And, the objective world can be depicted through photography, because subjective influences are initially absent. Of course, it doesn't depict a world that is the same from every perspective, but only one from each angle. For example, when you delve deeper and deeper into an object, you constantly see different structures. Which one is supposed to be eternal and unchanging? It doesn't exist. Quantum mechanics clearly demonstrates this. People who believe in God say that the meaning of life is to serve God. As I said, in my opinion, God is merely a product of the brain. To put it quite simply, these people are actually saying, the meaning of life is to serve the God product of my brain. Faith can generate enormous energy. If you use it skillfully, you can very effectively manipulate people for your own purposes. Religious leaders and secular rulers alike readily exploit this. What is the meaning of life for you? To live, specifically, to seek the truth. Beyond that, for me, the meaning of my life, meaning essentially means, goal, is to stay within the boundaries I have set for myself. And this contains the values that also give me security and health. You once emphasized, humanity grows until it bursts. I nodded. Billions of years ago, life began with growth. This drive is inherent in all living beings, including humans. As the past has shown, people always want more, to go further, higher, bigger. Especially to have offspring, as their instincts tell them. But all growth has its natural limits, something that humans, who are at the midpoints of this growth, don't want to see or can't see. And so, they continue to grow until they exceed these limits, and the bubble bursts. Then they begin to grow again from the wreckage until the next bubble bursts. And so, these processes will repeat themselves until the end of all living beings. And there's no remedy for this recurring cycle. For humans, perhaps, knowledge and contentment, but who strives for that? It's far more pleasant to indulge one's urge, one's feeling, like every creature, for growth than to experience the feelings of satisfaction. Actually, one only needs two things in life: health and sufficient means to continue existing in peace. And in that order. But, as I said, people generally always strive for growth. Their greed drives them for more and more. And that always leads to disaster. It's really like constantly adding more air to a balloon. Eventually, it bursts. He sighed. But unfortunately, as I said, it's inherent in living beings. Are you satisfied, Mr. Hermsk? I am, in fact. You see, satisfaction depends on the level of expectation, and on a realistic assessment of the goals you set for yourself. That is, whether they can be achieved. And I don't expect too much. I feel good about things as they are now. I'm relatively healthy, have enough money, no exorbitant desires, and I'm not driven by greed to always want more. For me, that way of life would be slavery. I'm very glad not to succumb to that urge, to be relatively undemanding, and thus to feel free.